So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce Jacob Andreas. He's an associate professor at MIT in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and a member of the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Center. Jacob's research aims to understand the computational foundations of language learning while building intelligent systems capable of learning from human guidance. He earned his PhD from UC Berkeley, a Master's of Philosophy degree from Cambridge, and a Bachelor of Science degree from Columbia. Along the way, he's been recognized with numerous awards, including the Solomon Fellowship, INSF Career Award, and several MIT teaching awards. His work also has received top honors at major conferences such as ACO, ICML, and NACLS. Please join me in welcoming Jacob.
Thanks, Kante. So, wow, is this thing on the middle? Okay. So I want to start with a pretty big question, which is the question of what machine learning is actually about. And the way we typically present it in, sort of an intro ML class, right, is that it's about building an automated system that can do some sort of task where we specify that task that we want to perform with data, right, with input-output pairs, maybe also some unpaired or unlabeled data. And it's this data, right, that tells the model or that tells the system that we're trying to build what it is that it's actually supposed to be doing. And I think this is basically the way the world worked for a long time, maybe until 2017, 2018 or so. But as we all know now, right, the world is a little bit different. If you use this sort of example-driven technique to train a language model, a system whose task is to predict the next word given some sequence of words that have come before, now you actually acquire a different way of specifying tasks. You can specify new tasks not just with labeled examples like this, but with natural language instructions, right? So here's an example from the original GPT paper where we can just describe a sort of particular weird pronoun resolution task that looks like this in natural language with no examples at all, and have a model pop out on the other side with something that looks like the right answer to this question. And so, basically LMs give us a new tool for solving a big ML problem or the big ML problem. Right now, even if we don't have examples, we have some mechanism for specifying desired behaviors using language. We can give instructions in natural language to a big enough language model, and it will follow that. Now, on one hand, this is magical, right? Even with sort of things in their not totally working state right now, I sometimes feel like I've woken up in a world in which magic lamps and genies actually exist. In practice, though, it is also often quite annoying to live in the current world, right? There's, to a first approximation, only one way to format a collection of labeled examples. There's a million ways of writing a natural language description of the same problem. And there's now a whole literature in NLP and machine learning devoted to showing that very, very subtle changes that we don't think are at all important in the way these natural language instructions and prompts get specified, can actually produce pretty dramatic changes in the underlying behavior of the model. And, if we abstract away from all of this, what ML is really about, or maybe what we want it to really be about, is building systems not just that do what I do, not just that do what we say, but that really do what we mean, right? Methods that can go from sort of the intentions that live inside human users' heads to automated systems that operationalize those intentions. I don't think we're quite there yet, and to think about how we might get there, it is useful maybe to start by thinking a little bit about how people solve these analogous problems of figuring out how to act in the world and figuring out what other people want us to do in the world. And this happens in a bunch of ways, right? This happens when we observe the world passively, when we experiment with it actively, when we pay attention to the behavior of skilled teachers and other agents that we know have behaviors that are aligned with or sort of related to ours. And maybe most importantly, and especially if we're interested in building systems with sort of human-like intelligence or human-like capabilities, we as humans learn from language, right? Which tells us not just what to do, but how to do things and why, and more generally, how it is that this world that we live in works, such that we can have a model of that world and use it to accomplish whatever tasks we're actually trying to do and to figure out what other people maybe want us to do. And something that's going to be, I think, a recurring theme in this talk is that learning from language in this sense encompasses a lot more than just next word prediction, and it encompasses a lot more than just being able to do instruction following in context. First off, right, when we read or hear a sentence, We don't just learn how to generate more sentences like it. We incorporate the content of that sentence into some sort of conceptual model of the world and of other people's beliefs that we're constantly building and refining. And maybe even more importantly than that, right? Language is not just a passive source of information for learning, a passive source of information about how the world works. It's a tool also for gathering information. When we're in teaching mode, right? When we're trying to communicate things to other people, we use it to figure out what our students know and what we need to tell them next. And when we're learners, we use it to ask questions, right? And to acquire the sort of bits of information from our teachers that only we know we need at this moment in time. So, I think we've learned a lot in the last decade about how to train big systems on huge pre-existing data sets. But I think if we really want to make good on this dream of sort of ML as a tool for building systems that figure out what we mean and doing that, we're going to need some way of taking the models that we have right now and equipping them also with the ability to learn very efficiently from small numbers of interactions with human users, and then remembering what it is that they learned from those interactions and generalizing in the way that we as people expect. And so this talk is going to be about some very baby steps or some tools that I think are going to be useful for accomplishing this high-level goal. A lot of this is sort of work in progress. Some of this is speculation. Since I'm down the road and we're local, if any of this is interesting and people here want to chat more about it or collaborate or whatever, please just shoot me an email after the talk. And finally, we have tons of time, so please feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any point here. So the first thing that I want to talk here is actually picking up on this last point about interactivity, figuring out how to build models that can sort of gather the supervision that they need from interactions. And this is going to be work, that's described in a couple of papers with a bunch of collaborators, both at MIT and elsewhere. So let me start by hammering home one more point from the sort of introductory section of this talk, which is that even if I want a model that implements a very simple behavior, like recognize pictures of beer, human beings, people, right, are surprisingly bad at constructing data sets that actually successfully uniquely specify this behavior and not some other closely related one. In ImageNet, right, for example, if you train on the beer class, what you actually get out is a recognizer for pictures of men holding glasses of beer and not other kinds of people and not other kinds of contexts. And again, even in the world of promptable models, right, it is really hard to get systems to do what you want by writing the right prompt. Here's a recent example, not to pick on the authors of what is actually a pretty cool paper from folks at FAIR, but where they have this throwaway line on like page 9 of a 10-page paper where some seemingly inconsequential change in the wording of a prompt basically caused this method from not working at all to being like a state-of-the-art fine-tuning method. And so, right, if we want to sort of make good on this high-level goal of building systems that can learn from our intentions, we would really like some better way than asking people to label examples and some better way than asking people to write instructions of getting the model specification out of our users or our model builders' heads and into the actual model. And it's worth noting that this is a question that people have been asking in the machine learning literature in one form or another for a long time. We have mathematical tools at our disposal here. And in particular, right, there's a long line of work that probably most people have seen on active learning, right, that sort of lets you figure out if I have a pool of unlabeled examples, which is the one that I ought to label first. And there's another line of work on sort of optimal experiment design that thinks even more generally, if I get to sort of choose which example to measure or what measurement to take, what example to synthesize even, and then get a label for that, what's the most effective way to do that? And so you can think of these as maybe first steps towards more efficient ways of getting ideas out of our labels or expert human heads and into models by asking them questions, where the one question that we sort of know how to ask is just, here's an example, here's an X, give me the Y. But of course, one of the things that we get along with language models, right, is not just the ability to sort of give instructions in natural language, but to also have these things generate questions, write text in natural language. Now, it's an interesting property, and one that we're actually going to come back to later in the talk, of current LMs, that they basically don't ask questions. If you give them badly written or vague an instruction that maybe even contains false presuppositions, they'll just run with it, make a sort of best effort response, and answer that question instead. And so the behavior that we get by default, even when we're trying to do these instruction following tasks, is not clarification, not follow-up, but just instruction following in maybe its sort of rawest form. But this is a design decision. This is something that really comes from probably decisions that product managers deep inside OpenAI and Google and whatever have made about the kinds of data to collect for training these models. But it's not one that we're totally tied to. And in fact, if you sort of set these models up in the right way, you can actually get them to start exhibiting information gathering behaviors that maybe even look a little bit more like these ones over here. So like the simplest, the stupidest possible thing that you can imagine doing here is literally just prompt a language model to engage in some information gathering behavior. And think of this at a high level as taking an LM, giving it an instruction to conduct an interview with a user about what it is that the LM is supposed to be doing, take the transcript of this interview, present it right back to the language model, and let it condition on that transcript in the course of doing some sort of task. And so this is the first thing that we're going to try and experiment with here, is literally just how well do you do using these models as sort of task elicitation machines rather than just instruction following machines. A brief note on evaluation here. We're not going to be looking at a sort of standard ML evaluation setup where there's a fixed test set off to the side, because we're interested in the extent to which we can actually get sort of individualized information out of individual users. After they get interviewed by a language model, only then are we going to show them an unlabeled test set, and we're going to ask them to go through that unlabeled test set and provide their own answers for the examples there. And then we'll take the LM on the other hand and see if it can reproduce the answers that the user that it was talking to gave for that test set. Now, this is a very general paradigm, right? You could imagine applying it to a lot of sort of knowledge-intensive or algorithmic tasks. What we're going to focus on here are really things that have a lot more to do with sort of personalization and individualized modeling in a couple of different domains where people have really idiosyncratic labeling functions. And this is both because I think these are kind of the high-value applications and because it lets us avoid the confound of models just knowing what everybody is going to say ahead of time. So we're going to be looking here at a content recommendation domain, an email validation domain, people's judgments about whether really bizarre-looking email addresses are well-formed, and a moral decision-making domain where we ask people sort of the conditions under which they would be willing to steal a loaf of bread. And again, this is the simplest possible thing we can imagine doing. We're going to prompt an LM. Your task is to learn what topics a user is interested in and reading online articles. You should ask the user some questions. We're going to try, we experimented with a couple of different question asking types, but basically this is the entire method, is this piece of text that we have on the screen. Once our interview is complete, we're going to go back and we're just going to sort of take that transcript from the first round and use it to label test examples all independently of each other. Yeah.
So aren't here we assuming that people exactly know what they want? They can articulate that well, because sometimes like the intent formation happens during the interaction, so we're kind of like pre-taking that cognitive effort, asking questions in the beginning of the interaction, and we assume in this one shot the LLM will be able to generate something that matches those intentions.
Yeah, so are questions being recorded? Should I repeat them out loud?
Sure.
Yes, I should repeat them, or yes, they're being recorded?
I didn't hear that one.
Okay, then definitely worth repeating. So the question is, people often don't themselves know exactly what it is that they want ahead of time. And so are we in some way, by setting the experiment up this way, failing to respect that process in the appropriate way? So, I think the fact that people often don't know what they want ahead of time, I think, is actually sort of the heart of what makes this whole task specification problem hard, right? The fact that people, even going back a couple of slides, right, are not sensitive to the correlation on the internet that exists between there being beer in a picture and there being a man in a picture is exactly what makes those specifications bad. And so I think, one thing that we might want from a sort of idealized version of this method is exactly that it brings to the surface considerations that people hadn't thought about before by, presenting informative edge cases that maybe they said, oh, I didn't realize, or I hadn't thought about what to do in that particular marginal case, or raising entire like features that input examples might have that people hadn't been thinking of as part of the input distribution. And so I think, in fact, what we sort of want to get out, and maybe one if we see, and we're giving a talk about this work, so you can imagine that there's probably going to be some kind of positive result. But if we see that these kinds of interactive elicitation methods are doing better than the straight up labeling thing, the fact that they are bringing to the surface considerations that people didn't think about before is one possible explanation of that. Another concern that you might have that's related to that is it possible that by using this particular protocol that we're using here, where we ask the questions and then people label the test set and separately the LM labels the test set, is people's choice of labeling function going to be influenced by the set of questions they were asked ahead of time? That's a super important point and one that we'll come back to in a couple of slides. But yeah, very good question. Anything else? Okay, cool. So, just sort of qualitatively, if you do this in these different domains, you actually get, again, despite the fact that this is not kind of default behavior by these models, if you give them instructions about how to ask questions, they ask pretty good questions. In this content recommendation domain, they're asking about sort of high-level features, not even of news articles, but just like topics that an individual person is interested in, sports and hobbies that they participate in, specific other content on the internet that they tend to ask for. If you ask about, in this sort of moral decision-making domain, you even get sometimes sort of reasonably sophisticated, like meta-ethical type questions about the sorts of considerations that people consider to be important. Okay, so, sort of qualitatively, we're getting questions. The questions look sensible. Coming back to this question of, one, is it actually the case that for these problems that we're looking at, people have idiosyncratic individualized preferences, or does the LM just already know what people want at the population level? And two, are we somehow changing what that distribution looks like by asking these questions in the first place? What we're looking at here is a plot in which the sort of horizontal axis shows the fraction of participants in this study who, if they don't interact with an LM at all, you just give them the test set and ask them to label it. The fraction of people that labeled a given example as yes or no. So each point on this graph is an example. This being right here means 50% of our labelers thought the answer to this question was yes, and 50% thought it was no in the content recommendation. So the first thing to notice here is that there is quite a lot of variability among the participants in this experiment about what it is that they want. That for a sort of large fraction of the questions, double-digit disagreement between what the right answer is. The vertical axis of this plot shows what happens for the same questions at the population level, what fraction of people answered a given question after interacting with the LM. And I think the main thing to notice here is that we're pretty close to the diagonal here. So basically, with a few exceptions, if I am a question where without interacting with an LM, half of the people in the world will say the answer to that question is yes. Then after interacting with the LM, also about half the people in the world will say the answer to that question is yes. Now, obviously, the version of this experiment that you would like to do is the sort of within subjects version rather than the between subjects version, where you interview people, you erase their brains, and then you have them relabel the test set without having been interviewed. We don't know exactly what's happening at the level of individuals, but at least at the population level, this doesn't seem to be moving things too much. Does it work? And the answer is sort of. So in this content recommendation, oh yes, question.
Did you by chance look at what the taxonomy the LLM was using after it was getting these preferences from humans and without that, like as a baseline, like what was its internal metrics for labeling that it used without the preference iteration from the user?
So the question is, what is, in terms of actual accuracy numbers, how well does the LM do if you just ask it to do this task without interacting with individual people?
What was its explanation for labeling stuff? Like, did it have some internal scratchpad of like, this is why I'm labeling this here, this is why I'm labeling.
Oh, so the particular way we're setting this up, there's no sort of additional thinking out loud before it answers any of these individual questions. There's a bunch of stuff that you could play around with the actual sort of prompt here, but in this case, like the thinking about the structure of the preference function is contained in the transcript and not in the question asking or the question answering. Okay. Right. So coming back to the question of whether it works, the answer is sort of. So on all the plots that I'm going to show you here, what we're measuring on the y-axis is the sort of time integrated improvement from the language model's initial guesses about what a person is going to want before it is actually interacted with. So we're actually taking each of these transcripts, we're dividing up it into sort of 1-minute chunks, and starting at t equals 0, t equals 1, t equals 2, up to 5 minutes. We're showing only the set of questions that were presented up till that time, and we're asking models to label the data set. So to get score, and then we're subtracting off of that the score at 0. So basically a score of 1 here corresponds to the model is getting everything totally wrong. Sorry, I think we're subtracting off 1, what the model is doing in excess of 1/2. Basically, think of it as like the top of this chart corresponds to the LM starts getting everything right as soon as it starts asking the user questions and not before. And below that is either it's not getting to perfect accuracy or it's getting there slower. Okay, so in this content recommendation domain where we have access to a natural distribution over labeled examples, you can do reasonably well, right? If you sort of just show people random examples and ask them to label them, you do okay. If you do active learning with a particular active learning method that has been found effective for these sort of in-context learning settings, you do okay. If you ask people to write prompts, you also do okay. So all of these things are giving us non-trivial user-specific lift over what the model thinks the sort of population level guess is. But actually in this interactive setting, you do substantially better than all of those things. In the other two domains that we looked at, though, the sort of story is a little bit murkier. In the email domain, you actually do significantly better. So first of all, the sort of whole thing that makes both the email and the content recommendation or the moral reasoning domains interesting is that there isn't, in some sense, a natural distribution over unlabeled examples that you could sample from. So we can really only meaningfully compare to prompting here. And here, on one hand, we do significantly better than prompting. On the other hand, it is not obvious that we do significantly better than just not interacting with a user at all and just letting the language model go with its first guess. In the moral reasoning domain, similarly, like you do actually get sort of non-trivial user-specific adaptation, but it looks pretty similar for prompting and question asking. Yes. Yeah, so this is, I wish now that I had a particular visualization of this, but basically, I can just draw on the chalkboard. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure for each user interaction basically think of this axis now as time. So we're not talking about these plots. And this is going to be basically the number of examples that the model gets correct. So over the course of an interaction with a user, they're going to ask some questions. If you give the model only those questions, the accuracy is going to go up. If you answer some more questions, maybe the model gets confused, their test set accuracy goes down. Over time, you hope it looks something like this. What we're measuring is the area here. So you make this number go up by getting right quickly, and you make the number go up by eventually being high accuracy. And then we're averaging these together across all these. Okay, so can we do better than this very, very simple method of just asking the language model to ask some questions? And to start to do this, let's sort of revisit some of the ideas from active learning, some of these old school optimal experiment design techniques. And what is it that prevents us from maybe even just directly applying these techniques in the case of sort of free-form natural language labeling tasks like the ones that we've been looking at here? And the sort of main obstacle there is that what we're trying to get judgments about are strings, right? Are sort of paragraphs or sentences of text. And for the most part, the methods that we have right now only know how to work with like nice, clean, structured predictors that live in nice, clean, structured representation spaces. So we're going to, again, use language models to help ask better questions once we start to move towards sort of more structured question asking techniques. But we're going to use them in a different role, namely as sort of formalizers of tasks. So we're going to start by prompting them with descriptions of the sort of high-level problem domain in which we're trying to operate. And we're going to ask these language models or prompt these language models to come up with a set of sort of abstract features in terms of which individual user preference functions might be specified. Right, so thinking about this content recommendation domain, maybe models will hypothesize that whether an article is about sports or not is a relevant feature. How long an article is a relevant feature to people's preferences about it, and so on. And we'll come up with a list of these features that we think might explain human judgments in this space. And we will then use a sort of off-the-shelf standard method for learning a linear model on top of this feature representations, where now the only role that the language model is playing is taking queries that our sort of classical method wants to issue about comparisons between feature vectors and translating them back into natural language. And then at test time, taking real natural language examples and translating them up into this abstract feature space. So to be a little bit more specific about this, right, the sort of first step here is going to be that we're going to come up with this list of features like we talked about before, maybe the topics of articles and some other structural properties they might have. And we're going to get these just by sort of prompting LMs to do these things, and in fact also to guess sort of plausible population level initial values for the importance of each of these features in driving a user's preference about an article. We're then going to consider the distribution over parameters of linear models defined in terms of these features that our language model just invented, and we're going to look for in this feature space a comparison between a pair of feature vectors that we think would be most informative in the sense of sort of reducing our posterior entropy about the actual user's feature function. We now know that we want to ask a question that compares the article with features 1000.1 to the article with features 0100.10, whatever. This is obviously not a question that we can ask a user directly, and so we need some way of now getting back into natural language space. And so we're just going to go back to the language model, and we're going to ask it to write an article with, has sports equals 1, length equals 0.1, and so on and so forth. And what you get out is a plausible looking natural language query. In this case, we're only looking at a question asking model where we're getting pairwise judgments. So do you prefer article A or article B? And so we synthesize article A, we synthesize article B in this place. We present them both to a user, and we ask which one they want. Yeah. The language model is just making it up. And I think like what the right way of coming up with these features is a really interesting question, and this is certainly not it. But as a first guess, we're literally just saying you're working in a new, a sort of like website content recommendation domain. We don't even show it any of the test examples, invent some features. And so literally, right, again, just like a query to an LM that comes up with a list of questions that you can ask about an article. Yeah, so I think for all the examples that we're looking at right now, it's going to be on the order of 10 to 20. 10 to 20, yeah. Okay, we get these user judgments. These are judgments about the sort of surface forms of natural language strings. We are going to interpret them as judgments in this abstract feature space where the query was originally issued. We're going to update our posterior, and then we're just going to repeat this procedure until basically time runs out, like here. Notice here that at no point have we ever presented to the user a real article. We've only ever sort of started by generating these queries in feature space, translating them into language, and then presenting those sort of synthetic articles to users. If we want this system to actually work out in the real world, we also need some way of going in the other direction. And so at test time, right, when we're presenting sort of real, concrete, natural test examples to the LM to label, we just use it to go in the opposite direction. We say, here's an article, here's the set of features that you think are relevant for expressing people's preferences, assign values to these features. And then what you get out eventually is a label, maybe with some confidence attached to it. Okay, so how well does this work? I want to go, so the evaluation setup here is the same as before. And I want to actually go from right to left on this plot. So this rightmost bar corresponds to exactly the set of experiments that we were looking at previously. We just prompt the LM to ask open-ended questions to the user. This is actually a new population of users and a slightly different set of content recommendation tasks. So we basically replicate the result from the earlier study. And this is nice. If you ask the LM not to ask these open-ended questions, though, but instead to ask sort of pairwise questions in the format that we're using on the previous slide, it's quite bad at asking for informative minimal comparisons between articles. And here you basically, like before, don't do any better than just going with its initial guesses without talking to the user. The same, it turns out, is if you even use the sort of fancy Bayesian question asking procedure I was just describing to generate the elicitation transcript, but then you condition the language model on that transcript and let the language model ask questions or answer questions at test time on its own. And so this is really interesting because here's a case where in-context learning is basically not working. We have an informative transcript of questions that was provided by a user, from which it ought to be possible to infer the user's preferences. But when you make them available to a language model, it's really not doing better than just guessing what it thinks is sort of the majority class for each of these test examples. Another thing that you can do in this paradigm, right, once you've generated a list of features in your domain, is not even bother collecting any data from the person at all. Just hand them the list of features and say, rank these from most important to least important, or assign these scalar scores corresponding to your judgments about how important those are. Whichever way you do this, this is also like not meaningfully better than not doing anything at all. So people are bad at assigning numerical values to their own feature labels, or numerical values corresponding to their own preference judgments that we're going to try to fit with this linear model. Nevertheless, if you do either something where you prompt the language model to ask pairwise questions, and then just train this little linear model, Bayesian linear regression model or logistic regression model at test time, that actually does surprisingly well. So that's this bar here. And this, I think, was the big surprise result, that the LM is now asking these questions. And we're only training a little linear model on the questions that the LM asked at test time. And that does non-trivially. But maybe unsurprisingly, the best thing is the sort of full loop that we described before, where you have some sort of structured process at the top orchestrating which questions you ask, and the language model is really just acting as a translator in and out of the structured representation space. Yeah.
How much domain-specific knowledge do you feel like we're embedding, like through the prior distribution and also this like larger feature set?
How much domain-specific knowledge are you embedding through the feature set? Well, is you the LM or is you the experimenter here?
You.
So I would say relatively little information about the task, the downstream task, gets into the model via the prompt, in the sense that we're really just saying, like, you're doing website recommendation. What are some features that websites might have? That being said, obviously, and I think one thing that accounts for the big difference between things working in the website domain and things not really working in the other domains that we saw in the sort of previous set of experiments is that these models have seen and probably been sort of targetedly trained on huge amounts of data that looks like generating and assigning labels to properties of websites, and have human domain knowledge of that kind in a way that there's maybe less of in the other two domains. But yeah, great question. Yes.
Do you actually think humans are not very good at giving, let's say, values on features?
Yeah.
That have been represented by the LM. Are they any better at finding the features?
So the question is, if people are bad at assigning these numerical scores, are they maybe even good at, or maybe nonetheless good at writing down the features that are relevant themselves? Yeah, so this is not something that we have experimented with. And obviously there's like a huge literature on survey design and on item response theory and on other ways of like just asking people questions that we could sort of tap into here for various ways of putting the experimenter in the loop, or the model builder in the loop that we're not right now. So yeah, I think the short answer is I don't know. And I think more generally, in some sense, obviously the wrong thing to do is to say, here's the domain up front, generate the entire set of features, and then never touch that list of features again. And so I think, in fact, the sort of main interesting future technical direction here is to figure out under what conditions, based on what kind of signal, do you invent new features? Do you say, okay, I think I've sort of explained everything that I'm ever going to be able to explain about the human's judgments with respect to the features that I have right now? What other features might I need to explain what's going on? And so this is something that we've like just started to do in the context of actually some robot learning problems in collaboration with Julie Shaw's lab and some folks at BDAI. There's also, I should note, there was like concurrent work that's actually using a natural language hypothesis space here rather than the structured linear model. And I think these are both super important directions, and there's just like a huge amount more to do here with regard to feature invention generally. Yeah.
Might be able to give some like clever information theory argument to like how many features you would need optimally. I don't know what, but that would be one way to figure out how many features you would need optimally for the.
Yeah, so the question comment is like, there might be a sort of information theoretic basis for figuring out what's the right set of features that you need. Yeah, right, and again, there's like, in some sense, what we're doing by adding more features is increasing the expressiveness of the model. People have been studying like structured risk minimization for a very, very long time, and I think there are lots of tools that we can bring to bear on this particular question. One other thing that I wanna, okay, so I guess one more comment on this slide, right? I think following up on that last point, what I think the real story here is maybe not actually that, sort of like classical methods for learning linear models decorated with language models in exactly the right way is actually the right way to solve this family of problems, and that the real story here is just that this is a computationally intensive task. You need some way of offloading or giving, sort of extra thinking power to your language model while it's learning in order to actually come up with a good representation of the posterior over the user's beliefs right now, whether that posterior is being represented in language, whether it's being represented in some more structured format. Right, this is basically a belief-based planning problem and is hard in the way that sort of all planning problems are hard for current LMs. And probably there's some way of doing this purely in vector space or purely in natural language. But really the important thing here is that, or at least the important takeaway from like this set of results is that there's some value in maintaining some kind of explicit representation of your uncertainty about what it is that the user wants at any given moment in time and conditioning on that thing when you're asking questions. Okay, one other sort of quick throwaway thing here, or maybe not a throwaway thing, but this general question of getting LMs to ask informative questions is useful not just for these sort of alignment or personalization flavored learning problems, but also for lots of applications where it's actually the human who's the learner and the LM who's doing the teaching. And so I want to give a quick shout out to my student Alexis's work on exactly these kinds of problems using structured, semi-structured, totally LM-based methods to generate good like homework questions and practice questions for people who are learning. Okay, but to sort of summarize this section here, I think the high-level takeaways is that learning from even very brief, right, like minutes long, free-form natural language interactions with human users is sometimes more accurate, sometimes less demanding than prompting or supervised data labeling. There was a question before about, is this actually supervising sort of novel concerns that people didn't think about? We also have some post-test surveys where we ask them exactly that, and a large number of people say, yeah, this, raised sort of corner cases that I wouldn't have anticipated on my own. Who knows, quite what to make of those judgments, but people are at least like surprised in a good way by some of these questions. That being said, right, the results are kind of noisy here in a lot of domains where there isn't already sort of a ton of training data. Asking good questions is still hard, and it's helpful to provide a little bit of extra scaffolding. Yeah.
Like ask questions, that would be. I work in human and AI interaction, and I realize that this does not generalize my experience. I like to see the output and then iterate over it rather than be asked questions. Yeah,
so let's see. So the question is like, do people like asking questions? Because a real HCI person says they hate answering questions. So we're showing only here. So first of all, there's a pretty big difference in cognitive effort required between asking these sort of free-form open-ended questions here and the like pairwise comparisons or yes/no questions. Or just label this informative edge case that I just synthesized. people, I guess we didn't, I don't know if we asked, I can't remember exactly what the specific set of survey questions was at the end. I don't know if we asked them, did you like it? We asked them how cognitively demanding was this? And maybe skipping ahead a couple of slides, like this is way more cognitively demanding than this. And so, yeah, definitely there is a trade-off there. I think people typically find answering like simpler questions to be less effort and to be comparable effort to labeling data. If they're going to have to do some kind of work, the labeling is easier than the open-ended question asking. They also hate prompting, or at least they find prompt writing to be quite cognitively demanding. But there's less difference between all of these things than I would have expected. That basically like simple questions good, and there aren't, I think, too many generalizations you can make beyond that. Yeah. Yes.
Clarification. The second one, the LM question, probably already mentioned what does that exactly?
Yeah, so what we're doing on this bar over here is that we're giving the LM a prompt. We're not doing our fancy optimal experiment design thing to get the pairwise comparison. We're just giving the LM a prompt. We're saying, ask for comparisons between pairs of articles with 1 or 2 examples of what those comparisons look like in a prompt. It asks all those questions. Post hoc, we say come up with, so I think, I'm fairly confident, but would want to double check that the like specific flow here is like before we ask the LM to come up with a set of features in the domain. We ask it to ask just directly like, here are the features that you came up with. Here are some pairwise comparisons to ask about. Those are totally synthesized by the LM. There's no fancy explicit representation of a posterior or anything. You then take the transcript. You featureize all the things that you compared, or that the language model proposed to compare in the transcript in the way that we do at test time. You fit a linear model to that labeled data, and then you just use that.
What's the difference between the LM and pairwise?
Yeah, okay, so the difference is what's the difference between language model questions, Bayesian predictions, and LM pairwise questions, LM predictions. So in both cases, the LM is generating all the questions in the same way. Here, at test time, you just take that transcript and you prompt with it. Here at test time, you featureize the labeled examples, and then you predict with a linear model. Yeah. And basically the reason this is bad and this is good is because this is bad, that models are just not actually doing the right thing in context with these pairwise. Okay. So to maybe pop up a stack level, we've been talking about efficient ways of getting information expressed in natural language about a task interactively by asking questions. If we now want to stick that information into a prompt, we've seen that it makes us better at the downstream tasks that we were asking these questions about. So are we done? And what else can we do? So presenting another paper here that was at ACL last year. I guess I didn't do names for the first one, but I'll do all the names at the end. This was led by Feyza Akyürek at BU with Ekin, Leshem, and Derry Wijaya. Okay, so right here was our recipe from the previous section. Basically, we prompted our language model to interview a user about a target task using some particular kinds of questions. And then we took that transcript, we stuck it back into the LM, and just prompted to sort of label new examples conditioned on the transcript. And in some sense, we updated the model with the model of the user's preferences just by prompting. And if we abstract away this recipe a little bit further, it looks like this, right? Generically, we have some new information we want to provide to an LM, some update that we want to make. We're just going to stick that information in its context window and then have it in the context window when the LM is doing whatever downstream task we want it to do using the new information and whatever else it knew before. This is incredibly effective across a wide range of tasks, and I think is in fact the sort of, the main reason why these things are actually useful in practice. Why might we want to update an LM, beyond sort of specializing it to a particular task? Classic example of this is sort of learning new words, right? Language is constantly changing. We have a word maskne describing the things that happened to all of our faces during COVID. We have the word Barbiecore describing this sort of hot pink dress aesthetic that was repopularized by the Barbie movie. And if you're training a model at a fixed point in time and freezing it there, it's not going to know what the kids are saying and you're not going to be able to sell your product to 14-year-olds. I was originally going to make some examples showing that ChatGPT doesn't know how to deal with Barbie core because this figure from this neologisms paper said it might not. In fact, ChatGPT, the sort of version that you interact with standardly, is constantly being updated, and it does in fact know what Barbie core means. So let's do the hardest possible version of this by inventing a neologism on the spot. Kakadekor, a word that is being introduced to the world for the first time in this room, an aesthetic characterized by classic men's tailoring, ascots, waistcoats, etc., especially in relaxed academic environments where everyone else is wearing sweatpants. Conveniently, the Kempner website has a picture of Sham with an ascot. So if we go to GPT-4 right now and we say write a brief 2-paragraph essay contrasting Barbie core, Kakadekor, and their cultural origins, we get a great description of Barbie core. We get a nonsense description of Kakadekor. It originates in Australian culture and its fascination with unique wildlife. Of course, this is terrible. We just made this word up. How could GPT-4 possibly know anything about it? I do want to flag on this slide, right? An appropriate response in a world where language models ask good information-seeking questions would be, what the hell is Kakadekor? And you need to answer this for me before I can actually go out and complete your task. You don't get that behavior. You get this sort of weird-looking guess instead. Let us instead prompt the language model with this definition that we provided before and ask it to perform the same task. You get a great, sort of reasonable-looking completion here that follows with and is concordant with the definition. I tried very hard to actually get it to sort of figure out that that Sham was in the background here, and it didn't. But hopefully, a future version of these languages will. So we can update things with new words by just putting the definitions of those words in context. What? Oh yeah, I guess question before the but.
Maybe you don't know the answer to this, but like, why do you think they haven't enabled handling these kind of examples? Because it seems like you could have some sort of like simple entropy-based criteria where the model just knows that it doesn't know what Kakadekor is.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So why isn't this problem fixed? I think there's a couple of different pieces of that. There's a like software engineering product answer to that, which is that a lot of the time these LMs are not actually talking directly to human beings. They're embedded in larger software systems where some user has pressed a button, a string has been shipped off to GPT-4, GPT-4 is sending back a string. That string is now going to be displayed somewhere in an interface, or a decision is being made based on what came back or something like that, where the code is going to break or a user is going to be really unhappy if the thing that they didn't even know was a language model call results in some piece of text being printed on the screen saying, I have a question, and there's no way to answer that question. There is also, and I think this is something we can talk more about at the end, but like a research question there, which is, I think the status of models' own like internal representations of uncertainty about questions is complicated. The extent to which they represent those things explicitly or in a uniform way that you could set up a little probe for is hard. You definitely can't get it just by looking at the entropy of the output distribution, because sometimes you have high entropy over a set of things that are all semantically equivalent. I mean, Martin is one of the experts on this, so I'll defer to him here, but like building those kinds of like tests of model internals for representations of uncertainty as a hallucination detection or prevention mechanism is like an active research question and quite hard. Yeah. Okay. So this is very nice that I can take this sentence and I can put it in context and things will work. It would be a real shame if everyone forever for the rest of time had to do this in order to learn about this beautiful sartorial concept that we are introducing to the world today. And in particular, if we think about a world where we don't do that, right, but where the text of these slides somehow makes its way into the training data for a future version of one of these models, what do we expect to happen? And what I want to claim is that what we should expect to happen here is basically nothing. That with the modern training recipe, we're going to take one step of gradient descent on one occurrence of the sentence in this training set. It will probably never occur again. And we just sort of don't expect computationally that models are going to be able to extract everything that that means and its relationship to all of the other words that exist in the world from that one step of gradient descent, even though whatever complicated conditional computation models are doing when we stick this string in context is going to let us get away with that. And I think, what's maybe especially compelling about the neologism example here is that if you imagine the fully generalized version of this, where I'm defining an entire new language for you from scratch, if you want to do that in context, and if you never pull that back into your weights, then you're having to relearn that language from scratch every time you do a forward pass through your model. And either practically or computationally, this just seems not tenable. And so, right, all of this comes together to make what I think is actually a pretty subtle point, which is the following. The models that we have today are pretty good at modifying their behavior in context in response to a single new piece of information, if you prompt them with it. The problem is that you can't put everything in context all the time, and that's actually the obstacle to building models that can sort of learn continuously in a robust and coherent. And so if we want to make good on the sort of first part of the talk and in a general way, being able to learn from these sort of brief interactions with people, and more generally, right, if we want to be able to update LMs in whatever way, we almost certainly need some way of getting those updates into the weights. And just to sort of reinforce that this is actually a problem that exists in real models, here's an example from a paper called The Reversal Curse by Berglund et al. That came out earlier this year. GPT-4, I think, if you ask it who is Tom Cruise's mother, it produces her name. If you ask it who is her son, it says, I have no idea who this person is. And so somehow models are just not, even for the information that occurs in their training data, sometimes, and maybe the stuff that occurs sparsely, they're representing in a more sort of superficial, surface statistic-y way and not fully absorbing into their complete model of the world. So how do we do that, right? How do we build models that cannot just learn to sort of imitate the surface form of data, but actually learn robustly from the content of that data in a way that they seem to do in context? And so here's a recipe. Here's our sort of big idea for this section. We're just going to take advantage of the fact that prompting works super well. And so given some new piece of information that we want our model to absorb, we're just going to put it in the context. And we're going to prompt a model to generate all of the documents that might exist counterfactually in a world where this new piece of information had been true and people had been writing about it forever. So basically, take some piece of new information, condition on it, generate everything that is implied by this new piece of information, and then just do ordinary fine-tuning on all of the data that we generated. And that's the model that we wind up with. And there's a sort of hollowed out arrow here because in all the experiments, I'm about to show, we're just going to do sort of one step of this. But in principle, you could iterate it. So what does this look like in practice? And maybe the first claim that I want to make is that this is even a slightly more general recipe than just model updating thing. And so if I have, say, a large collection of documents from a trusted source, maybe even a collection of documents that I already saw during pre-training and took a lot of gradient steps on, or one gradient steps on, or whatever, if I pull chunks of text out of those documents, I generate things implied by them in context. What I sort of expect this to give me is just a more robust general procedure of fine-tuning models on factual content, to sort of understand factual content contained by, expressed in their training data. As we saw before, if we have these sort of little atomic updates that we want to make to models, this is a way of applying them and really making sure that they ingest all of the sort of implications of those new updates. And maybe most suggestively, one thing that we can imagine doing is getting this source information from an LM itself. And so thinking back to, let me go back a couple of slides, our Tom Cruise example over here. Right. Language models capable of generating this sentence by itself, properly prompted, it can surely get from this sentence to the inverse of that sentence, right? Mary Lee Pfeiffer is the mother of Tom Cruise. We'll see this in a minute. And so if we could just do this on top of a model that was already trained, maybe even without any additional training data, we now have a mechanism for sort of enforcing internal consistency. Yes?
I'm just trying to get a sense for how you think about this example, because it's plausible to me, like in the database literature, there's like I think there's like computational issues of like how fast you can find certain things. So do you think this is like a chain of thought issue versus like it's not clear people, like I'm sure like people you could probably do similar things like this, and you have to do like multi-step reasoning. If your database only I think you have graphs where you can you kind of need a fair bit of computation to bring something out, or you need like a lot of space in your circuit to actually kind of quickly get the answer.
Yeah.
distinguishing.
Yeah, so each of those pieces, I mean, certainly people do this, like there was definitely a period of time in the last year after we moved offices during which I would have said yes to the sentence, like so-and-so works in this building and so-and-so works in that building, even though these things were not true at the same, couldn't possibly be true in a single world. There's the question of, is this the sort of thing that an LM, if you had just said, let's think step by step before coming up with the answer, would have been able to get right? I think in this example, the answer is actually probably not, right? There's not any thinking here. This is just a factual retrieval thing where somehow the representation of Tom Cruise contains a pointer to Mary Lee Pfeiffer and the pointer doesn't exist in the opposite direction. But certainly, one thing that is very closely related to this is thinking about the set of questions where you can't get them in a single shot, but you can get them via chain of thought. And right, people have now written several times the paper that says just do chain of thought and then distill on your downstream answer. The challenge there, and I guess this is also what you were alluded to, is you can't possibly memorize every implication of every fact like all the way out to infinity with a finite amount of capacity.
Yeah.
So there's
Like the extreme example. Suppose I had a hash table and I'm just randomly hashing something, then you're gonna have to like go down the order, check every bucket, is it there, is it there, is it there, kind of thing. So I mean,
yeah, well, so there's the like literal low-level computational, where do these lookups live in the LM? But I think even more than that, right? There's just the like, you can't, the sort of deductive closure of all of the facts that you know is infinite, and it contains a bunch of like highly consequential things that are not known to the human species right now, like whether the Riemann hypothesis is true, to choose everyone's favorite example of the moment. And so obviously you can't like run this forever and expect it. So I think what you expect, one question you can ask is what do you get from a single step of this procedure? What you get from a single step of this procedure is at least like a little window around all of the things that you believe right now that'll maybe be, give you a little bit more coverage than the kinds of things that we get with current editing methods. One thing that we didn't do in this paper but that I want to do a sort of more formal treatment of at some point is in the setting where all of the facts are being generated by the LM itself and it is internally sort of self-contradictory anyway, like what actually is the fixed point of doing this procedure? And I am pretty sure that for some way of setting up that problem, you wind up at a state where your marginals actually wind up sort of consistent and better calibrated than what you start with. But the sort of broader question of how do you decide which things you are eventually going to want to do a bunch of computation to produce at test time. How do you decide which things you need to cache? I think is super interesting and like not one that I'm going to address at all today. Yeah.
On this point, I wonder if, it's not just about cache looking, but about forcing consistency, right?
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent part of what's going on here when you do this kind of procedure is you're teaching it a kind of meta principle about consistency as opposed to just trying to expand the deductive.
Yeah, and we'll maybe come back in a minute to the meta point about consistency because there's interesting experimental stuff. Yeah. Yes.
So this sort of like failure of reasoning, or this failure of symmetry here, this will happen with facts, and I guess that's why people say we need knowledge augmentation and see things in various ways, like sort of the Alan geophysics and climate model type stuff. But I'm interested in why it's the case that when it sees these sort of rare long-tail facts, the symmetry fails here. But if I were to ask it about, is the fraction 7/9 equal to, and then I, arbitrarily blow up both the numerator and denominator to make sure it's never seen that number before, it will reason perfectly fine about that. Like it won't make a symmetry mistake when you present it with a math problem with maybe like two numbers. It has not seen its retraining.
Well, so I guess one, I'm not sure that's actually true in a fully general way, except in models that have, been very targetedly fine-tuned to not make embarrassing grade school arithmetic mistakes. I think the honest answer is we don't have a good enough mechanistic understanding of what's going on inside these models to like really answer that question. If I had to guess right now, it's something like, coming back to the hash table point, there is literally a matrix somewhere in the model that's functioning as lookup store where you plug in Tom Cruise mother and Mary Lee Pfeiffer. The first token of Mary Lee Pfeiffer pops out the other end. And the opposite relation is just not encoded in any table anywhere. And again, I think you have to do some amount of this because the alternative is to like recapitulate the entire history of the universe from scratch every time you do a forward pass in order to make sure that everything's clear. Okay, moving on so that we have some time for questions at the end. Right, okay, so a couple of different ways we can think about doing this. In the, basically depending on the source that we draw our information from here. What we're actually going to do in the experiments that I'm going to show is a slightly fancier than just prompting and fine tuning on the results of those prompts. What we're actually going to do is the follows. We're going to sort of seed the LM, ask it to generate a bunch of content related to some particular input statement or in some general domain of interest. So here we're having it generate facts about the Emperor Meiji. And as it is doing this, we are also going to ask it to label each of these with a sort of numerical score for how likely it thinks it is that this particular fact is true, independent of anything else that it's doing. We are going to set up this prompting in such a way that the model is forced to, as it's doing this, label other facts with what it thinks their logical relationships are between the source facts. So here, it also generates Emperor Meiji was the last Japanese emperor. It is labeled this as contradicting the first statement, but also that the probability of this fact is 0.6. It's more likely true than not. So we have two things here. The language model thinks they're both more likely true than not. It thinks they contradict each other. The notion of contradiction here is extremely subtle, right? Notice that it is not like literally logically incompatible that Meiji was the last Japanese emperor and the first emperor of modern Japan. There's a pretty subtle pragmatic inference here that you wouldn't say he was the first emperor if there weren't emperors that came afterwards. And sort of classic scalar implicature type example here. And so what we mean by implication here is going to be a slightly richer notion of it than we typically think of in logic. And we can do this for things that are implied by other facts and so on and so forth. Once we have all of these things, before we fine tune on all of them, we are actually going to just pick out a subset of them to fine tune using these logical relationship labels. And in particular, we're going to pick out that subset that is sort of marginally internally logically coherent and most likely to be true. And in that case, we throw away the top statement, even though the model initially thought it was true, and we retain this bottom statement down here, even though the model initially thought it was more likely to be false. Once we've selected this particular subset here, we're just going to fine tune the language model on all these extra things that we generate. And in fact, we can do this in parallel for a bunch of different sort of seed sentences all at the same time, and basically do this all in one go. I want to sort of call out here that this is an idea that's come up in one form or another, or at least pieces of this idea have come up in one form or another, like many times in the last couple of years. So there's both a very large body of work that does this procedure on the right side of the screen at test time. When I'm asking when I'm trying to answer some new question, I first generate the sort of neighborhood of things that I know around that question. I reason about, what sort of set of answers to all of the other related questions would be compatible with the one that I eventually want to give. There has also been a bunch of work on various forms of this basic notion of sort of doing something that looks like distillation from a model that has information in context into a model that doesn't have information in context. And this includes both, sort of earlier work that we're really building on here that just takes a straight up representation distillation perspective on this without any of the sort of fancy logical inference machinery, and a bunch of work that came out after this, including this recent paper from Tatsu Hashimoto and Emmanuel Candesa's paper that does a version of this condition on a trusted document thing at a very large scale and finds scaling benefits to this. Right, and just to make this point one more time, right, you can use this in a bunch of different ways. You can do it unsupervisedly by just sampling text on a topic of interest directly from the LM, or supervisedly with either an edit that we want to make to a model, maybe make it believe that country music is from the United Kingdom, or just sort of generally fine-tuning on factual content. So one surprising thing we're evaluating here on a fact-checking data set. So we have sort of single factual statements. The model just needs to flag them as true or false. And we're going to do this in the sort of totally unsupervised way where we just take a bunch of stuff that we know is true that may or may not have any relationship at all to the actual things that are going to be in the test set. We generate our little neighborhoods around those. We enforce consistency. We fine tune on those. And what we find is that without doing this, sort of enforcing of internal consistency step, you still actually get little gains here just by conditioning on the logical neighborhood around your training set. But by additionally enforcing consistency, models get even better at the fact-checking task. Coming back to what Sam was saying before, the sort of spooky thing here is that the text that we generate, the sort of factual content of the text that we generated, really doesn't necessarily need to have anything to do, and in some cases doesn't have anything to do with the things that we're being evaluated on at test time. This is not a new observation in this paper, right? People have been remarking for a while that just fine-tuning on stuff that's true makes models better at labeling other things as true or false in factually unrelated domains. This is just a way of squeezing a little bit more out of that, but I think is consistent with there being one of the things that you're learning is some meta principle, either that you're supposed to be internally consistent, or at least just that the task that the distribution that you're supposed to be modeling is the distribution over correct labels rather than incorrect labels. Why it is that just fine tuning lets you do this, I don't know, and would love for somebody to explain. Sorry about the table here, didn't have time to convert this into a nice bar chart. What we're looking at now are some fancier versions of this method. Here's the case where we are actually getting sort of new relevant facts about some new domain of interest. You can ignore the stuff in the middle, which are just ablations. Factual accuracy improved pretty substantially here. And maybe the sort of one of the other interesting things that you can do is if you know what the test set's going to look like, but you don't actually know what the labels are for the items in the test set, you can still do this trick of generate related content to what will eventually become your test set, do the reasoning there, and that works. And surprisingly, again, I think related to this sort of meta principle thing, works better than doing one of these fancy like test time graph inference procedures. We can do this even on a sort of subset of the data that's been designed to be minimally contrastive, right? So pairs of sentences that superficially look very similar to each other, like US Route 1 connects New York to Florida, and US Route 1 connects New York to California. Pairs of statements that, look related, can't possibly both be true. And what we find is that by doing some flavor of this, you can both reduce or increase the coherence of model judgments, right? The set of facts where it asserts that they're both true, and just overall improve the fact-checking accuracy on this task. You can do this not just on these sort of generic fact editing data sets, but on fact checking data sets, but on things that are supposed to be targeted tests of like model editing, like very surgical interventions into their factual knowledge. And basically this works way better than either sort of model editing or representation editing techniques, which basically don't work when you care about multi-hop conclusions from new information, or even to just sort of conditioning with an OK retrieval augmented model on the new information. And finally, we can come back and look at these sort of reversal examples that we started this section of the talk with, Tom Cruise's mother going in both directions. And what we see here, on one hand, yeah, we do a lot better at the task, right? So if you look at the model's accuracy on the set of sentences that we actually use to train it, obviously normal fine tuning memorizes those. We basically succeed in memorizing those. If you look at what's happening in the reverse direction, both sort of standard off-the-shelf context distillation methods and ordinary fine-tuning don't learn anything at all from these examples. Pretty remarkably, we only learn to get about half of them right. And some of this is just because the model never, we tried, I think here, we actually just used basically the same prompt off the shelf that we were using either in this task or that task. Certainly, if you engineered it to like specifically reverse all of the examples on your own, I'm sure you could get to 100% on this task. But it does seem to be the case that there's a bottleneck in our ability to generate the set of like relevant, interesting things in the neighborhood or things such that when you fine tune on them, you like really model the entire factual neighborhood, because here we only get it about 50%. Okay, so to sort of wrap up this section, right, we can do now, or maybe as motivation, right, probably language learning from continually, right, from small amounts of new information requires computing all the implications or some of the implications of this new information and getting it somehow into the weights of our model rather than just carrying it around in the context. And a pretty effective way to do this is to just have models do, at training time, a little bit of extra reasoning about those implications of its training data, and then just memorizing all of those, or doing SGD on all of those with the limitations that that normally has. To speculate a little bit about what comes next or what ought to come next, right? Obviously, we still have many problems with today's LMs, despite the fact that they're as good as they are, right? When we think about procedural tasks, it is sometimes the case that models can write down an algorithm for addition, great, but can't actually add numbers together in a robust way. The opposite is also true, right? We have cases where models have learned some procedure for doing some sort of task. We don't know quite what that procedure is, and they have no way of articulating it. If you prompt them to do it, they just give you something that doesn't correspond to their behavior or say, I don't know. Coming back to a question that was asked earlier in the talk, right? Why is it that models don't say, I don't know how to do this task or ask a question in response? Well, part of it is just, because of the way they're trained, because of the way the sort of modern training SFT RLHF recipe works, there isn't really anything strongly enforcing correspondence between models' external expressions of uncertainty and their internal expressions or representations of uncertainty. So we get these sort of weird hallucinations about made-up facts. And coming back to a point that Sham was making earlier, you only get the step-by-step reasoning when you're instructed to produce it in context. And that means that sometimes you don't do it when you need to and would benefit from it. And sometimes you don't do it when doing it at training time would have let you get away with not doing it at test time. And so the sort of pieces that we've been presenting in the talk today, right, are on one hand a sort of mechanism for collecting targeted supervision, small amounts of supervision corresponding to things that a model might not know, with the important caveat, right, that here we were looking mostly at these personalized tasks rather than the kinds of things that you would want to elicit for like training a big public API LLM model, which would probably require slightly different techniques. And also a mechanism for taking this supervision, getting it out of the context and into a model's weights in a way that, not perfectly, but a little bit more robustly than current tools, causes the new information to be assimilated into, sort of general processing in the new model. And you can imagine cranking this through loop, right? Using good question asking mechanisms to gather useful new pieces of information, incorporating it into models by absorbing the synthetic information or absorbing the synthetic data that you generate conditioned on this new information, and then repeating this loop now with a model that maybe is more internally coherent or has a better model of the world. And I think you can tell a story about how you might address or start to address all of the different failure modes on this slide using something that looks basically like this mechanism, noting again that some of these are already things that people have names for and have started to do in the literature, like chain of thought distillation. And so think of this maybe as just kind of a meta recipe for enforcing coherence, across sort of computational procedures, across contexts, across facts. And there's a huge amount to do here. I'll just say again, like, I would love to collaborate with, I know there are folks here who are also interested in these kinds of problems, and please do get in touch if you want to talk more about this stuff after the fact. And with that, I will wrap up. As always, all credit to the actual sort of students and postdocs who are doing the work here. Belinda Li, Alex Tamkin, and Kunal Handa, who did the question asking stuff in the first half of the talk. Feyza Akyürek, Ekin Akyürek, and Leshem Choshen, who did the deductive closure stuff in the second half of the talk, as well as various faculty at Stanford, Oxford, Brown, and BU, who were also involved in these projects. And thank you all for having me. Yeah.
Right, like on one end, you're going to train with more factual data in the neighborhood of this function, for example. The other regime, maybe you're doing more step-by-step reasoning. Like, they're kind of like a third area where we just represent internal representation of these things, so that I can just say like this or this plus the kind of other something moves towards this. Or, like it seems like there might be something in between there that maybe gives us kind of agree with that.
Yeah, so the question is, on one hand, we can do things in context, like in the first half of the talk. On the other hand, we can do this sort of laborious synthetic data generation followed by distillation thing in the second half of the talk. can we not simply cause models to structure their internal representations better, such that you maybe sort of fine tuning in the conventional way does what you want it to do? I think this is a really good question, and I do not know the answer to it. I think one way of asking that question is, does there exist a parameterization of a language model such that one step of gradient descent or one step of some relatively simple update procedure, or n steps of, basically application of some relatively simple update procedure that doesn't go through synthetic data produces the same effect as conditioning on a new fact. I have had an undergrad like heroically trying to do this for several months, even in a very, very, very toy problem, and it seems like really hard to do. I think just like computationally, the sorts of procedures that we have for manipulating weights are way underpowered compared to the kinds of computations that a pre-trained LM on the entire internet can actually do itself, right? And I think this maybe shouldn't be so surprising. Certainly, right, it's like a contingent fact about the world and about the way English works that this thing implies the reverse of this thing, so we shouldn't expect like gradient descent natively to have this behavior because there's lots of domains where it's undesirable. Does there, maybe exist some special parameterization such that, and I mean, this even comes back to a conversation that we were having earlier today, right? Like, is just straight up fine-tuning meta-learning in a strong enough way that we can find some point in parameter space with the property that continuing to fine-tune on whatever we want produces all of the additional updates that we want? This is an empirical question. I think it's probably not true, but I don't actually. One reason to think that it's probably not true comes back to the question of like, what is it that computationally you need to do if you are a transformer in order to be an effective next token predictor by the time your 48 or whatever 128 layers have run out? And at some level, I think that does necessarily require fragmenting information rather than storing it in a unified fashion, just because you can't, obviously, like, words exist in complicated, structured, asymmetric relationships with each other of the kind studied by lexical semanticists forever. You could infer, right, just knowing that good means something and that bad is the antonym of good, what bad actually means. But you would rather not, right? You would rather just be able to see the token bad, have access to a representation of the meaning of the word bad, and never have to think about the sort of lexical environment in which it lives, unless you're like explicitly asked to do so. And I think, in fact, the reason why a lot of these sort of model editing techniques that try to make surgical interventions on models don't propagate facts super well, and this is something that we've like worked on and tried to get working and had even less success with than the editing technique, which I think is Mehmet here. The stuff that works maximally well. And the problem is just that this stuff is not actually stored atomically, and I think stuff can't be stored atomically if you're going to have efficient computing. Yeah.
So for, I guess, both part of the talk, you can think of these as methods for improving data efficiency. Like, you want to collect data that can be maximally informative, or like, given the data, you have like extract lots of information. It's sort of like for a kind of very restricted setting in some sense. You think this can like generalize to reduce the amount of data you need to train, like actually for a pre-training model from like the trillions of tokens down to something more?
Yeah. So the question is, think of these all as ways of basically improving sample efficiency in a world where sample efficiency doesn't actually seem to be the bottleneck. Do we care? And so I think one way of answering that is that once we, going back to the first half of the talk, right? Once we start to think about personalization, once we start to think about individual users making small local updates to their models on the basis of information that only they have access to, like in those settings, downstream users of these models still certainly care about sample efficiency, even if OpenAI doesn't. That being said, I think even if you're OpenAI or Google or Meta or whoever, you care both because there is some amount of just like super long tail stuff that only occurs once in your training corpus, and that you really would like to sort of learn from or learn the implications of in a way that it seems like we can't right now, right? Like words, Zipf's law, words follow Power law distribution, lots of words. I mean, I would be curious actually, and you could compute this if current training corpora for these models are so big that if you compute like where Zipf's law ends based on the vocabulary size for English, maybe we're already past that point. But probably not for other languages and not with respect to the distribution of not, words, but other like weird niche problems. The like futuristic answer to that question is there's probably stuff that is contained implicitly in training data sets that will never be written down by humans or won't be written down by humans on timescales that we care about. And and this requires much more than just like one-hop logical neighborhoods around this things that you've seen before. But if you have some general mechanism for saying like, hey, here's a topic that I don't know about, and maybe I don't know about it because it involves a really hard search problem. Maybe I don't know about it because it's a really niche problem and nobody's bothered to like put all of the relevant pieces of information together. But if they did, then some useful new fact would pop out with the flavor of scientific discovery applications. Like if you could do that, then this is something that's useful to everybody, right? The ability to actually derive new knowledge from training sets. Now, obviously, the stuff that I'm talking about today here does not do that. But I think you can at least tell a story about how you might get to that by just sort of turning it on. Yeah.
How does one preview look like for all of these tasks?
How does, sorry?
Performance on the one preview look like for these tasks?
Well, so I guess for the tasks in the first half of the talk, I don't know, because we sort of wrapped up all these experiments before O1 preview existed. I would expect it to just sort of do better at everything. I mean, maybe even the sort of weird in context learning not working thing here goes away in current models if you give them the ability to do step-by-step thinking. A way of thinking about what's going on in the second half here, right, is what would happen if you were to do O1 at training time and not just at test time. And in some sense, right, we can't, like, what does editing O1 look like? Or what happens when you edit O1 using these kinds of tools is not a question we can answer because we can't fine-tune O1. But you could imagine doing something like this. And maybe even OpenAI is already doing this with some flavor to train those models. And this comes back to the question before about like, how do you decide where, given that you have finite model capacity, what computations you want to perform inside during the forward pass, what computations you want to just like totally memorize and store in a lookup table somewhere, and what computations you want to have to invoke, let's think step by step for. But however, whatever sort of utility function you're using to trade off between those things, you minimally want some mechanism for building models that sort of know when they need to think more and when they don't. And it's not clear. I mean, we'll see this once they start giving people the ability to change the computation knob in O1, but not clear. Yeah.
I mean, this is more, it's a thing we've seen all the time, like scale fixes a bunch of things and sure, we're, arguably maybe a factor of 2-ish more data out there, but there's other things people are trying to do, like this sort of mid-training that you're right that it's somewhat capacity limited, but it's pretty clear that within a constant factor, like there's value in sort of growing it. So, for some of these, it's not implausible. You could do some like these tool formats, just like tagging, do like another whole pass, because you could argue the first pass you understood a lot of how things relate to each other, but like the first time you saw this, or you didn't really get all the concepts. The second pass, the model just knows how to tag things in different ways, and then and that makes it easier to handle this because like these tool format things, you just have some API and the model just explains explain things and like inserts things into the text where you do another pass of the data, and it's not implausible something like this can address a lot of this.
Well, yeah, I mean,
but basically the broader question is like, we'll scale and some simple tricks kind of fix it.
Yeah, well, no, but maybe what you're describing with, going back and doing a second pass and inserting extra context into the second pass, like, is another instance of the sort of meta family of approaches here, right? And the question is, what are those annotations that you want to add in the second pass? I don't think it's the case that like just doing one more pass over the data without making any changes to it is going to do anything. And no, but then I think the research question is, what is
There's a separate thing of like a human in the mix.
yeah, well, okay, so that I think with regard to like under what conditions do you need a human in the loop? I don't think you need that if you're and so I think it's if I'm sort of an individual that's trying to specialize a model and I have a bunch of data and maybe it's a small model, you want to be able to do that efficiently. If not, you still at least care exactly about sort of being able to extract all of these consequences. And I think the research question is, what's the right way to do that? Maybe the sort of the idea here in the space of generate new data conditioned on your training data or generate extra annotations conditioned on your training data is that one sensible thing is to generate these sort of like logical neighborhoods around examples, in addition to doing the chain of thought distillation thing, in addition to probably, doing the like Eric Seligman star thing where you insert chains of thought in between words and all of this. Yeah.
Let's think of